Wow, we got a lot of people here. Okay, I think we have like 40 minutes.
Can we handle that?
I think so. So I'm going to start with something with just a couple data points because we had a credit panel like this last year at this conference. And just a year ago, a lot has happened in 1 year's time. So today, a 30-day treasury bill yields 4.6. A year ago, it was 3 basis points. It was nothing. In fact, when my guys gave me that number, I called them back and said, are you sure it was 3 and not 30? Because it's hard, like it's just so crazy that money was that free. The 2 years at 4 1/4, it was at 118, and the 10 years at 355, and it was at 179. That's a big, big change in what someone can do with their money by just forgetting interest rate risk, just parking it and clipping a coupon. And so it makes it more challenging for guys like this to take capital and go put it to work when they're competing with a 4% money market fund, because that gives liquidity, you don't take any risk. And then these guys come along and do some form of private lending or some sort of distressed or some sort of credit opportunity that promises a greater return in exchange for locking up your capital, believing they won't lose it, and when it's all said and done, and you don't live in a state like California, you have something left after taxes to spend. Josh solved that problem by just moving to Texas. So, I'd actually like to start with, for like the last 3 years, maybe even more, guys have been setting up distressed funds and opportunistic funds because this big distress cycle is coming. And eventually, they'll be right. You're starting to see some fraying, but I'd like to start by having each one of you just quickly jump on this and respond to, when you're underwriting today and you're thinking about the risks that exist, one of them being that you've got to earn a return that is harder to achieve because you're competing with the risk-free rate. You've also got a crazy political climate. So everybody probably watched, because it was like driving by a car accident. You got to slow down and see it, even though you shouldn't. But watching Kevin McCarthy become Speaker of the House, and this is not political, so this isn't about Kevin, this is about the state of this country and the political tension. So it took 15 rounds for him to become Speaker, and it was basically thrown into a quagmire by just a small faction of people that wanted to hold firm to their ideological beliefs about what should be done. So now he's there, and just a couple weeks later, that word that keeps coming up every so often, debt ceiling, the debt ceiling question gets raised. And I asked a question of a couple of our managers who happened to come in that next week. We've got this very polarized government. People can't agree on anything. It's really tight, and we have a debt ceiling thing. Is it possible that this time we actually default, that we can't get it done, and there is a risk that the government defaults? So I asked managers, do you see that as possible? And if you do, what are you doing about it? Guys, it's a real possibility. I think we all have to believe it won't happen, but it could. And if it does, do you see it as possible, and what are you doing about it? Mike, you want to start?
There were like 6 questions in there, Jeff, but and then you ended with one.
Yes, well, I ended with one. So the rest was a setup.
I think we all manage similar strategies in different forms, but one thing that many of us do is run funds with long lives and long lockups, and the ability to move around the markets, liquid to illiquid, up and down the capital structure. So the anxieties, I think, that public market investors feel, wringing their hands over political winds changing, various geopolitical headlines. We have to be very macro aware, but we have to invest most of the time in specific company cash flows, specific assets where we actually think that we can create value over a long period of time. So I actually don't think it will happen. Information is coming at us faster than it ever had, and I think that the markets gyrate more in response to headlines than they ever had. But we've all been doing this a long time, and I think we've all made money in Democratic administrations. We've made money in Republican administrations. We've made money in split Congresses. So the idea that now we're in a completely different political paradigm and the investment landscape will fundamentally change, I don't ascribe to that. One other quick comment is, I think most people are buying opportunistic, distressed, special sits credit, not as a replacement for 7% high-grade bond yields. Because right now, everything that you own, the good news is now you can actually put money in treasuries and make 4.5%, but everything you owned is now down 30. So if you're a pension fund or an institutional investor that was allocated to credit and just sat there and took 400 basis points of pain, you now have to dig yourself out more. So we're actually seeing more people looking at alternative credit as a way to fill that hole. So ironically, the better it's getting in traditional credit land, the more appetite we're seeing because people are trying to generate a lot of excess yield to make up for loss in their book right now.
Jeff, I'd add to Mike's comments and say that a lot of the risks you're talking about may be more equity risks than debt risks. You're sitting in, maybe the 70th to 75th percentile of valuation based on whether it's forward earning multiples based on projections, whether it's enterprise value to EBITDA, but almost any measure you have sits in that general vicinity. It's pretty clear that a lot of earnings are going to be challenged by the fact that those estimates were done before that change in Treasury, so the base rate's up massively, and a lot of companies have leverage. Labor costs are up quite significantly. You might even have a little bit of a reduction in demand. You're seeing that in certain companies, depending what your view is on recession. But, and then you might have some of these exogenous factors. None of us was exactly predicting a second lockdown in China or a war in the Ukraine. So you could have some other bolt of lightning come from outside. But betting on those things as an equity player is very, very different from when you have $500 billion sucked out of mutual funds and things are getting puked into the market because they're offering daily liquidity on a product that shouldn't be enjoying daily liquidity. And so you pick and choose, and all of a sudden you're in the mid-teens on something that doesn't make any sense. And even with the interest rate backdrop where it is, I'd argue that stuff has tremendous credit merit, and if it doesn't, it has tremendous ownership merit because you have such a large cushion underneath you. So I think you don't have to be killing yourself trying to fret too much over the debt limit or fret too much over some of those macro factors. You do have to think about how a recession, depending on how deep you think it might be, might affect the business you're doing because you're looking fundamentally at cash flows. That's what we're all micro guys in a way, but we're very aware of the macro backdrop. I just think that a lot of the questions you're asking are really more related to the perils of equity investing than they are to the perils of credit investing in the current environment. Very different when you're trying to say, oh, this bond yields 6, I think it should yield 5. That's a little different game from where we are today, particularly on things that trade a little bit by appointment.
I would say, if you take a little bit of what Mike said, which is actually, if you all think about it for a minute, if you're a pension plan, your bogey is 7.5%, right? Somewhere around there, 7%. You've got to make that. Pension plans today are very focused on making that bogey. Making 4% does nothing for you, right? You're negative. Forget the fact you've lost money, you're negative. So I would actually argue that our job here has gotten easier for all of us because a year ago, if it was 3 bips, which is where treasuries were, we have to still make that bogey for people. We had to, I don't even know what it is. It's probably 100 times the risk-free rate. Today, all we've got to do is make 2 times the risk-free rate, right? If you sort of think about that, our job has gotten easier, and you've got more opportunities. That doesn't usually happen. It doesn't happen that I've got more to do, and my job is easier because a pension plan now is going to say to me, great, make me 2, 3, 4 times the risk-free rate. They're thrilled if I'm making 4 times. Last year, if I made 4 times the risk-free rate, I made you 12 bips. Whoopee, right? Think about that. So today, I'm a hero if I do 4 times the risk-free rate. And I think for all of us, when you take a look at what's going on, there's more opportunity than there used to be. That's the good news. There's more risk. But if you stay at the top of the capital structure, so I think all of us here are lending money. We're all lending money anywhere between sort of 8 to 15%. I'm going to tell you we're doing it better, but that's a whole other issue. But if you sort of think about it, you didn't have that a year ago. And so we're getting all overpaid for the risk. And I think we're taking less risk because right now, I mean, I know Josh is doing it, I know you're doing it. We're demanding terms that you couldn't get a year ago. So it's actually become better. I would say you want to be all in credit because equity has just got a lot more risk because I don't know where you are 6 months from now. Things are either a little bit better or they're a little bit worse. And the equity market is living with that every day, whereas for us, we're thrilled. I mean, higher rates, everything we're lending money on, I'm pretty sure is
It's been
floating.
a long time if you think about it. We're all seeing fundamental strength in the portfolio
Yes.
with rates going up. So, but when we get to a default cycle, if we do, you will have accumulated
A lot.
800 to 1,000 basis points of excess return before you're talking about loss given default. Whereas in prior cycles, rates are moving down quickly
down.
while your earnings are falling out of bed and you're chasing that return. So this is a really unique setup from an excess return
So
standpoint.
I think it's great. I think for us, this is a great time for what we're all doing. And, you know, I hope it lasts another year or two. But I think we're all getting massively overpaid for what we do.
I'm not, for the record.
You're not? You're not? Okay. We are.
I think we are too. Look, I think, again, they all kind of answered the 6 questions pretty quickly, but
You must have better fee
I'm
structures than we
gonna
do.
finish it off quick. I'd say one, we're also buying down our basis a lot faster. Like the last decade, effectively, if you made a mistake on a 5% or 6% yielding portfolio, you really couldn't earn it back. Now you're at least getting 10 points, you're buying down your basis by 10 to 12 points every year. So effectively, even if you assume we go into a recession in a year or 2 years, you're lowering your cost basis much faster, which was really the foundation by which, you know, high yield and alternative credit was built on. So that, from that perspective, at least I feel like it's, at least you are getting compensated.
Yep.
And 2, because you have a higher coupon, the actual amount of debt you can put on the capital structure, you can't service the debt if you kept the same quantum of debt. So you're just going to structurally have less debt. Forget terms for a second, which you're getting better terms. You're just going to have less debt because to service that debt, they have to now assume a 4% base rate, right? So, you know, any model, any CAPM, any business school model you've looked at, if your top 30% of your capital structure or 40% of your capital structure is costing you 9 to 14%, I can promise you the equity multiple that you should put on it is not the equity multiple where the public markets trade today.
Yeah.
And so risk adjusted, there's a massive convergence going on. You know, most LPs I haven't talked to, I mean, in the last 10 years, there's LPs coming out of the woodwork, and I'm sure all you guys are seeing this, and I haven't talked to you since pre-GFC because of this 7.5% concept. They were effectively forced out of every credit instrument, by and large, to go into equity, private equity, long duration equity, structured products, CLO equity. It was either, for us, it was either go,
SPACs.
whatever, yeah. You name something that they could put on paper was going to generate them higher rates of return. And now it's like, to make 7.5 to 10 with a high probability, if you're not allocating to credit, it's just, I mean, it's very hard to argue that you're not allocating to credit. So every strategic asset allocation is pivoting towards credit, which is kind of what I think.
It's interesting, John, when you talk about from the mind of the manager, buying down basis is how we think about it.
Yeah.
In the mind of the investor, it's liquid. And when you're generating 10 to 12 on senior loans against a bogey of 6,
Yeah.
that's creating meaningful liquidity for redeployment into your portfolio. So we're having conversations with folks now that they've always had appetite for increased illiquidity, but they now view shorter duration credit in this rate environment as actually liquidity enhancing.
Makes sense.
Which is pretty unique.
So stay on credit but move it into real estate. One of my friends said he sees a painful period coming for repricing real estate. And someone who shall remain nameless made a comment just a short while ago about having bought a home here and top ticked the price of the house, but he bottom ticked the financing of it. If real estate's really going to have a massive repricing, all of you in one form or another are lenders into real estate. That's your collateral as opposed to the corporate earning stream of a business. Do you see that coming? And if so, what does it mean? What does it mean in terms of how you'll underwrite and what loans won't get done?
I think, well, real estate is a huge global addressable market. It depends on what geography you're in. It depends if you're in office, retail, hospitality, multi-industrial. So I don't think you could just say real estate.
Right.
But generally, real estate is more levered at the asset level. And if you look at everything that's not multifamily and industrial, you probably have some structural headwind that you're dealing with in addition to the increase in rates. Now, most real estate equity investors will tell you that statistically, cap rates don't correlate to interest rates, which I think is complete BS. But the math says that they don't, so that's how people talk about it. But there's a massive basis reset going on in the real estate markets right now. That will take some time to play out. Transaction volumes are down, and a lot of capital structures are upside down. In places like multi and industrial, you're still seeing double-digit rent and lease increases, so they're absorbing the increase in rates. But places like office and a lot of these CBDs, it's really, really difficult to envision a world where the equity isn't, severely impaired.
I think you have 3 or 4 things going on. Number one, nobody knows what the hell the price is of any asset. Take the most simple, basic infill, multifamily. Everybody knew it was worth 3.5% cap rate, right? That goes to 5. You can have a hell of a lot of rent inflation. It's not going to cover the difference. So you've got, number one, nobody knows what the value is, so volumes of transaction frozen. Single family residential, which is highly dependent on mortgage financing, volumes have frozen. Then you get to other asset classes. Well, then you have all these shortfalls in financing. So you have things that are midstream that have been bought with construction loans, assuming there's going to be a refi that takes place once it's done and leased up, and the proceeds are going to be half what they were. And either the LPs are going to have to put up money, or some clever lender sitting on the stage is going to give them some money at a very high rate, and maybe it'll work out, and maybe we'll own the building. It's a painful adjustment. We all remembered when an 8% cap rate, at least I do, maybe Lasry and I don't know because we're old enough, but we remember when 8% was a very low cap rate. Like, who'd buy it at 8 cap rate? Jesus, thing's supposed to be 11. Well, then they went to 3.5, 3.25 with all this hope that the rents would go up. So you have the cap rates are a problem, the financing's a problem, the use is a problem. Things like office, we saw it in retailing first, right? All of a sudden, malls were worth nothing. One of the big bankruptcies we were involved in with CBL is secondary malls. They had Sears and Kmart and Penny, and now all of a sudden they're blighted properties. And the banks hand it to you and go, we don't want to deal with it. You're going to see that in office next. Nobody wants to be in B office. So then you get all these clever guys going, we're going to convert this to residential. I don't know. The rest of you got to drill a hole in the middle of it so you don't have apartments that have no view. You have to have a atrium. It costs so much, and the regulations are so bad. I think a lot of Third Avenue is going to be worth whatever the land is worth minus the cost of taking the building down. While at the same time they're paying $160 a foot to be in One Vanderbilt. So I think that B office, A office, and then the last factor is this tremendous migration going on. You can't give away a building in San Francisco right now. That's a bit of a self-inflicted wound, but it is what it is. And we're seeing major migratory patterns, and this is obviously one of the areas where you've seen the most inflow. So I think real estate is in a real price discovery mode right now in a lot of asset classes. And so the volumes have dried up, and we'll see where it shakes out. But it's
the opportunity to restructure the upside-down capital stacks is going to be one of the great distressed opportunities I think that we will have seen.
Because a lot of people won't have the legs to be able to sustain what they've built. They might have the construction loan, but they might not have the permanent financing. They might find the use change. It's a very dynamic business and historically a very leverageable business. But that negative arbitrage business doesn't work so well, and the cost of capital is pretty high now. So I think I agree completely with Mike. I think it's going to be one of the most interesting areas in the distressed market that we see. And the Fed, when the Fed raises rates and it wants to kill inflation, like one of the reasons they do so much jawboning and telling people basically, we're going to raise rates, because they want you to restrain your own demand. If they do it all with interest rates, then it's a very unfair and very cruel instrument. And that, like, the first thing it hits is single-family residential because of mortgage rates, and it hits other areas differentially too. So they'd rather have a general demand back off than do it all, without giving you any announcements and just doing it with interest rates. But it really affects real estate.
So guys, when I look at the private credit market today, our firm's been allocating to it for a long time. We do it in client portfolios, and we do it in separate vehicles where people just get that access. And we just keep seeing the opportunity sets coming to us. And I don't see that changing. The only thing that really possibly causes it to change is if the banks somehow retool themselves and decide they're coming back into that world. But the private market's been replacing what banks have been walking away from some time. Do higher rates cause banks to rethink their approach to this and start competing with the four of you and everybody else that's in that world that's filling that void? Because it's just going to grow.
I don't think so. I think it's not really a bank decision. It's a Fed decision. It's a structural decision, right? So like if you look at Europe, the ECB has sort of come out and said, we're not going to rate these loans. If this is a non-rated loan, you can't borrow against it, right? This isn't like a bank saying, it's not JP Morgan going, oh, let's go back in the market and do this. They'll do it a little bit, but a lot of what's going on is structural issues, and we're stepping in, right? And we're providing that liquidity. So to me, whether rates are low or rates are high, it's not forcing a bank to do something. The thing that's going to force a bank to do it is if ultimately, look, all a bank is, I'd love to have that business. I'd love to borrow and be levered 10 times, right? 'Cause that's all it is. Bank has 10% equity. You're borrowing from the Fed that's giving you at the lowest cost possible, and then you lend that money out. So, shockingly, I think everybody here is, we have to give, we only get to charge 1%, 20% of the profits. We should be doing like 5 and 50. I don't understand why, if we
He is getting overpaid. I knew it.
I think this is being recorded, Marc.
I agree with Marc.
No, but if you think about it, our cost of capital is very high. It just is. Mm-hmm. I think all of us here have an 8% pref, right? You might be lucky and get a 6% pref, unless you have a hedge fund structure, a liquid structure. But, we're paying 8% for that money. So before we make money, a bank is borrowing, at 1 or 2%. It's wherever the Fed is giving them money. They've got a massive structural advantage, and they're not taking advantage of it. And the reason is because they can't borrow it from the Fed. The minute you can borrow from the Fed, they'll do that. So I think that's what's going on. And I think on the credit side, it's a little bit what we've all said. We are finding so much to do because there's a lack of capital. As long as there's a lack of capital for all of us, you guys, in your insurance company, how much money do you have there? It's
280 billion.
Yeah, 280 billion. That's real money,
It's 95% IG. It's like all.
But still, it's real money, and that's what's going on. That you're able to get paid for this, and that's what's different.
Yeah. Again, I think part of what's happened, I think unintended, is that people don't realize, like Bank of America, not to pick on them, most banks have very large, long duration mortgage books. So Bank of America, for example, has 175 billion book equity. Non-mark to market, they have close to 100 billion of losses from the rate move. That, I think the unintended consequence of pushing everybody into the mortgage market, frankly, from a regulatory standpoint, actually, they didn't realize that would seize up a lot of liquidity, because once you're effectively marked at par, but the mortgages are at 70, that used to turn over all the time. That was a liquidity tool for these banks. And so you'll hear a lot, okay, risk-weighted assets were upside down, we don't have liquidity. A lot of the regulatory from GFC pushed everyone out of leverage lending, out of all the activity that we do, and pushed it into effectively agency and very safe mortgages that are super long duration. And because they don't have to mark to market, they never really hedged rates. So now you have $100 billion of losses, non-mark to market, sitting there. You see how it happened with Silvergate, some of the smaller banks. There's other banks that are completely offsides on this, that if they ever have any deposits, they have this massive asset liability mismatch that historically you don't typically think of at the bank level. And I think that's just all accruing to us. They don't really want to be in the leverage lending business. I know people talk about it a lot, but like, you know, they had
JP just said we're going to dip our toe in with a $10 billion.
Yeah, like they're not really, like, they don't, I don't really think Washington really cares about, I know this is going to sound like a big number, but like $1 trillion, $2 trillion market, right? The mortgage market's 16 trillion, the commercial market's 4 trillion, the consumer market's 4 trillion. They care about the consumer and not socializing losses at a bank. If all of a sudden private institutions with private capital are actually financing the leverage finance market, I actually think that's a win for Washington. And so like alignment is actually with us as long as there's more capital. And what you've seen happen with you know, Credit Suisse, we've been in the news recently, having purchased their asset-backed business. You know, this is a 200-year-old bank. I joined Apollo 11 years ago. If you told me we were buying $1 billion net income portion of Credit Suisse's bank at Apollo, I would have laughed. I really would have. I would have laughed about that. And that's kind of the state of the market. You know, you have huge institutions getting pulled huge divisions, in some cases, #1 in the league tables for 5 years, getting pulled out of long tenured, pretty prestigious banks. And if you put a gun to my head, I actually think a lot of that leverage finance activity over the next 5 years will actually could be pulled out of the banks and really be managed by people on like that sit up here. So I think there's a big shift going on in the world.
One of the things that you asked what stops the banks from competing on these things.
Yeah.
First of all, they have a huge regulatory issue because the government's essentially guaranteeing their deposits. So they have, I mean, I don't know how many compliance guys they have at JP Morgan, but it's something like 40,000.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't quite have that. We only have a very big compliance group. It's nothing like that. And you've seen this huge migration from public markets to private markets because of the burdens of the regulatory structures around public markets. The second thing is what really stops the banks, because they do get pissed off when they see Apollo and Ares ahead of them in the league tables. What pisses them off is when they stub their toe and when they make the Twitter loan. And then all of a sudden people go, oh my God, what do we do with this thing? It's worth 70, maybe on a good day, maybe 60, I don't know. Or they do the Citrix loan, or they do this, or they do that. It ends the same way every time. The private markets do a more efficient job at it. They're better at underwriting it. They're quicker. They're more nimble. They're more flexible. They have, you know, they tend to have better
capital
people.
matches. The capital matches the actual liability.
And the personal capital does too. The human capital's, it's different. And then the banks decide to get really tough and compete and start doing bridge loans and this and that, and then they get hooked.
Yeah, and I don't think anyone up here, I mean, maybe some of us will disagree. I think at the end of the day, we really want the good assets and the yield for our clients. We don't really want the client. And the bank wants
You don't want the what?
We don't want the end client, the corporate. Like, typically, we're okay with the M&A and the advisory and all these services going to the bank, which are asset-light advisory. They have amazing origination machines at the bank. The natural partnership is we're long capital, short origination generally, meaning non-sponsor origination, all other stuff that the banks do. And they're long origination and effectively short the right capital for that. So there's a natural thing, it's just they do get upset a bit when they think that we're trying to take something from them. But I don't think it's about the fee gen necessarily. I actually think most people on the private side are actually okay.
I would imagine that the large alt managers are some of the largest bank clients as well. I mean, it is a very symbiotic relationship. And when you actually do the math on RWA, what people don't talk about, if you looked at the loan-on-loan wholesale financing portfolios at most of these banks, they've been growing at the same compound annual growth rate as our businesses have. So most of the time when we're putting together diversified portfolios of private credit, the banks are coming in and leveraging them 1 or 2 to 1. So they're getting exposure, they're just getting it in a high-grade equivalent manner. And when you do the math on RWA, it looks like it's a 30% ROE
They're getting
versus
much
a negative.
Better. Yeah, much better ROE.
And so the regulators prefer that, right? They're getting the exposure, but they don't actually take the risk.
If you think about what Josh said, and I think Josh is absolutely correct, Twitter has been great for us. I mean, it really has. We didn't invest. I mean, I don't think anybody here invested in it, but it's been fabulous because the banks have gotten crushed.
Well, it stopped them in their tracks.
Right. So because of that, now banks are like, okay, I don't want to even do that anymore, right? So it enables firms like ours to keep doing more on the credit side and lending, and banks keep realizing when you have a debacle like Twitter, that what am I doing here? It's easier for me to do the origination business. It's easier for me to make these other fees, whereas I think you're absolutely right when you talk about when you have banks looking at it. We don't care. All I want to do is get paid. That's all. All I want to do is get paid at the end of the day. It's not, hey, can I do more business with who I'm lending money to? Sure, I'd love to, but I just want to know I'm getting paid, and I want to know that if there's a problem, I'm going to be able to recoup my money. The bank is going, look, we don't want to ruin the relationship, right? I don't know about you guys. I'm happy to have a relationship, but I'd like to make money off of it, right? It's not.
Sometimes you can have both.
Sometimes you can have both.
Okay, so I don't know how much time we have.
It's right there.
13 minutes.
Where?
13.
Oh, okay, great. So I
People
can't
are
see-
pouring
And
in
by
for
way,
the exciting
everyone's hearing about
panel
the
you
panel,
guys.
so everyone's coming for credit. They just keep, it's,
Oh, yeah, you got-
they're hearing how well it's going. So more people are.
So
We're going to stay
a
extra.
lot
Don't
of
worry.
people in this room allocate money to private credit, but everybody's got a limit of how much they can do. So if they look at the opportunity set in front of them today, and you just divide it into two buckets, US private credit opportunities and the rest of the world, Europe, Asia, et cetera. Wait, there it is. Where are the opportunities? Where is there more alpha opportunity? Where are the fat pitches in the world of private credit allocations today? Where you guys see it?
Go ahead, Marc.
I was just going to say it's different. It's not. U.S. is more liquid, so you're able to do. You can come in and out a lot easier. Europe, I think there's more opportunity, but it's less liquid, right? So at the end of the day, we can take advantage of a lot of things in Europe. Asia is the same thing, right? The further away you go from the U.S., I think more opportunity, but less liquidity. You've got a major war going on in Europe. That creates issues. We don't have a lot of those issues here in the U.S. So I would sort of look at it, it's easier for people to invest in the U.S. because they're more comfortable. Europe is a little bit more opportunities and people are comfortable there. And then Asia would be next.
I'd say our opportunity is different, certainly from Mike's and from John's, in the sense that we're a much smaller firm.
Right.
So, and what has happened is certain people have sort of left the middle of the market because they've got a big scale business of growing these direct loan unitranche deals, and they've left a lot of room for the one-off, highly negotiated special situation direct loan, which is more of what we focus on. I would say that, so I think the market has to be segmented a little bit when you look at it. Not all private credit is identical. The other thing is, I think, to Marc's point, I think governance is a big deal, rule of law. We all feel much more comfortable in the US, and for good reason, or in the UK for good reason. After you get outside the U countries, the US and the UK, you start getting to other countries. Whether it's India, Indonesia, Iraq, Iran, or Ireland, or Iceland, I is a pretty tough letter sometimes. So you got to be careful where you work because the rules aren't the same. And Asia is tough. Emerging markets are tough for creditors because the rules of engagement are usually highly advantageous to the local equity guy and not so advantageous to the creditor. So for those of us who've been around long enough, you just learn to avoid those things or protect yourself the best you can, and you figure out who your right partners are. But for us, it's mostly US, Western Europe with different emphasis in different countries, and then a little bit down under, once in a while something in Japan. The rest is really hard for us. And it's just hard to compensate for the risks. In some of those parts of the world, there may be very, very attractive growth characteristics and very attractive investment opportunities, but you're probably better off being in liquid equities than you are being in some illiquid credit, where if there's a problem, you get smoked.
John, do you guys think about, I mean, like, look, it may be less liquid, but you're also taking that capital from investors who are locking it up with you for 5 years or 10 years. So the liquidity doesn't matter other than your own portfolio management aspects. Does that impact the way you think about putting the credit out? Do you need the liquidity inside your fund, or are you willing to underwrite that you're not going to have that?
No, again, a lot of the loans that you're making today, the likelihood is they're probably taken out at the first call. That's the truth, right? So
they're probably taking out what?
They're probably taken out at the first call. So the debate is more about not whether or not the creditworthiness of new origination, it's the duration of the capital. And how do you balance your multiple of invested capital relative to the yield on invested capital? It's very hard to debate that the IRR is risk adjusted in credit, that you're gonna get a better 18-month or 24-month vintage than you are. That it's like very unlikely. In other markets, like we try to look at where the biggest imbalances are. We don't, I think the biggest imbalance that hasn't hit yet is really around this normalization to a normal cost of balance sheet. Like that's a big theme that you still have lots of people trying to understand what that means. Equity markets, we don't think still have figured out what that means for the right equity multiple. But that also means like thousands of fintechs, thousands of kids that said, hey, you know what, I'm gonna build an algorithm that originates small business loans. And guess what? My cost of balance sheet was 0. My cost of origination was 0. And I had full liquidity to securitize the loan. There was no risk in that business model. Now all of a sudden, they have no balance sheet, they can't get warehousing, and they have an algorithm that can originate loans that they can't hold. So like, there's these huge ecosystems that have been created from 0 cost of funding and 0 cost balance sheets that need to be fixed, that are kind of outside the scope of, I think, at least what we've traditionally done. So things like tech transition, where you've had $1 trillion of equity capital go in, and now no capital, effectively no capital, and really hard to find the price of that capital. Fintech lending, how do you actually access and who's gonna be the winners and losers? Those are hundreds of billion-dollar opportunities if balance sheets are gonna stay at 4 or 5%, that are outside of the scope of traditional sponsor lending, which we think is a great business right now. So I think you can mix. There is still some pretty big imbalances. And broadly speaking, if central banks want to keep rates high, there's still a lot more to come from that, because it's really only been like 5 months. Most of the rate hikes came through in the fourth quarter. You've only had a quarter or maybe 5 months of tighter financial conditions from higher rates. Let's see what it looks like in a year. I think you're gonna see a lot more need for our capital. So we're trying to stay around a lot of this stuff where there's been imbalances.
Where do you guys, you have to be thinking about this as you think about the next year or two. And I can't imagine people in the audience don't want to at least hear your view on this. Do you have a perspective on what the Fed is doing in the next 6 months to a year?
I think they're telling you what they're doing, and nobody wants to believe them, and they've been saying it, and no one's listening.
Why is that? Is it like like a hopeless
a decade of stimulus? Every time the market goes down, you're going to respond.
People are hard. It's hard to believe that the feed trough has been taken away, maybe, but they've told you exactly what they're going to do. And I think almost every Fed governor has come out and said, we're taking the terminal rate at or around 5, and we're going to keep it there. And if you look at the forward curve, it says that we're going to give up somewhere between 40 and 75 basis points in the back half of the year.
And so probably back to 0
by the end of 2025. So that's not what, in my opinion, that's not what they're going to do, but the market desperately wants that. Well, the market wants that because, to John's point, if you're an asset owner, if that doesn't happen,
you're screwed.
You're really screwed.
I mean, go back to commercial. Go ahead.
So therein lies the answer to when is the next credit cycle, distress cycle really going to come?
No, everyone worries about our private lending books on the corporate side. I actually think most of our companies at a first lien basis can withstand a pretty tough. But most of these private real estate loans, they don't sit in a lot of funds. They sit on a lot of bank balance sheets. That's like the big left tail. No one wants to talk about that, and it doesn't mark. And your valuation framework is on rent rolls from 2019. Literally. That's how you value it. You value it on NOI based on rent rolls from 5 years ago that are still running through, right? It's pretty scary, actually, parts of that market where the claimed LTV on lots of those lending books. And that's going to be a lot worse in a permanently higher rate environment than a corporate book. A lot worse. And so that's where I personally feel if rates stay higher, that's probably the biggest tail in the whole market. But we'll see. I mean, since 2000, there's been 35 trillion of equity markups in CRE equity on pension balance sheets. It hasn't been marked down.
35 trillion.
Yeah, of equity.
That's a lot.
Yeah, I think it is.
But Howard Marks had an interesting comment on this, when he talks about the sea change and,
Yeah.
And I just thought his comments were pretty astute when, you ask people what's normal. I'm reading all this stuff from various economists about, well, we're going to return to normal at this point. We're going to return to, well, what was normal? Was normal post '08, which has been constant interference with interest rates, or is normal when the market actually sets interest rates? I tend to think that maybe this is more normal, and that we don't really ever quite get back to the old normal the way people were used to it, unless things get a lot more painful than I suspect they really will get. So I'm kind of in the same camp as Mike on what the Fed will do, but I think it's also hard to know. The way I think of it is that you used to have this market where everyone was trained by the dips, by the dips, by the dips, and now we're kind of in the sell the peaks market, because every time the market goes up, it gives the Fed license to be a little more aggressive and for a little longer and a little tougher, because hey, what's the damage? And if unemployment prints are continue to stay at 3.7, 3.8, 3.9, 4%, I mean we had huge rounds of applause when unemployment went below 5% last time around, and now we're 3.7. We have a little room for some cushion in the economy, and then people get alarmed about these tech layoffs. There was an interesting piece I read today about how the number of layoffs are a tiny fraction of the post-COVID hirings that these companies have done. Tiny. And so I think that it's a mistake to think that we're going to return to the days that were so abnormal and for such odd reasons. And to think that's where we're going again is just a bad mistake.
Can I add, it's interesting, when we were here last year, and I think we were at the end, same thing.
Yeah.
It seemed to me there was more people leaving last year towards the end. I think it's fabulous that all you guys are coming in.
Such huge interest in credit.
And you're like, there's so many, right? It's so many, and I think, look, for me, I think what we should do is just keep going. Because there's just more people coming in, obviously.
I was going to say, we have to excite them for the
Right.
last segment. I mean,
there's
how
just
fun is lending? How great
Right.
is lending to private companies? Who wants to hear how excited it is?
It's obvious that it's all about lending, and look, I think I've never seen so many people be so excited about what we're doing.
Well, how many?
Thank you.
Okay. And on that observation, because that's a really good way to end this, I am going to end it. And thank all four of you
People
for
want you to stay.
making the time to do this. This was great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jeff.